I heard the pressure fall, and not a bubble. Underwater. Silence has teeth. I should have counted seconds, but I only counted the body. 3 minutes later, the radio clicked. Status. And I lied. I wasn't supposed to be alive. Not without an explanation. Not without gravity bearing down on every breath. The Zodiac rode the surf like it hated us. Wet sand slapped the hull. Diesel hung in the air and coated the back of my throat, mixing with salt and that thin metallic taste that always arrived a heartbeat before the blood did. The flooded pier approach was a black seam in the pre-dawn, pilings half swallowed. Everything slick, everything ready to slip. I didn't think in names. I thought in margins. Time, blood, oxygen. The arithmetic you did when the answer was already ugly. Behind me, my black coffee thermos rattled in its pouch. A tiny clink, like a spoon tapping glass. Phantom tremor. It showed up when my hands didn't have work. My fingers hovered, useless, and the rattle got louder, like my nerves were begging for a task. Then the water went wrong. The blast was a deep whump that hit my ribs before it hit my ears. The Zodiac lurched. Someone yelled, but surf swallowed most of it. The pier pilings shuddered. Vibration ran through wet sand into my boots, a hard tremor you could feel in your teeth. A body dropped onto the deck with a wet, heavy thud. "Doc!" Brix's voice cut through. Loud, even when he tried to be quiet. Loud was his habit, his shield. Femoral bleed. Dark and fast. The kind that didn't ask permission. My brain snapped into machine mode so clean it felt like relief. The thermos went silent. My hands steadied as soon as they had a job. I tore the CAT Gen 7 free. Velcro went rip. Sharp as confession. I shoved it high and tight, higher than polite, then cinched until the strap bit. The windlass fought me. I talked it down until the bleeding stopped and the leg looked wrong in a way that meant right. The casualty tried to speak. It came out as a wet cough. The smell hit me. Blood metal, salt, diesel, and the sour edge of shock. "Stay with me," I said, and it wasn't comfort. It was an order. His breathing was off. One side lagged, every inhale a climb. I kept my face close enough to insert the change, close enough to catch the slip. The ARS needle clicked in my grip. I didn't think about its name. I thought about the sound I needed next. Resistance, then a give. A hiss followed, sudden and ugly, like air escaping a tire. The sound made my teeth ache. His next breath came easier. Not good. Easier. "Ket," I said. I pressed a ketamine lozenge into his mouth and watched his lips try to cooperate. No morphine. Not with this bleed. Not with this sweat turning cold on his skin. Brix hovered too close. I could smell his gum, cheap mint trying to cover fear. I could hear him swallowing. "Boat's jacked," he said. "We're..." Brix swallowed hard, eyes flickering away, as if the words cost him. "Then move." I cut him off. Dry sarcasm was easier than panic. If it ain't bleeding, it ain't my problem. My hands stayed on the casualty. My mind tracked everything else. Surf. Distant gunfire. The low groan of stressed wood. The radio crackled once, and every muscle along my spine tightened. The water near the pier smoothed out. Not calm. Wrong. Like a sheet of glass laid over a mouth. I looked up. About 50 meters out, something rose from the surface without splashing. No thrash. No panic. Just head and shoulders breaking the water as if the ocean exhaled it. No bubbles. None. The sea should have been foaming around a swimmer. Instead, there was only silence pressing against my ears. A ghost diver. I didn't know if it was a man. I didn't know anything except the absence of sound. Rebreather logic. Draeger, LAR-5. If the silhouette was honest. The kind of gear that made you invisible to people who listened for fear. He watched. Not hunted. Not rushed. Watched. Like I was a sample pinned under glass. The casualty under my hands made a choked inhale that turned into a thin whine. Warm blood stayed tacky under my glove despite the tourniquet. Behind me, my thermos clinked again, the tremor trying to crawl back now that the crisis had a breath of space. Doc, Brix whispered. His volume fell off a cliff. You see that? Yeah. My throat felt tight. Not emotion. Air. The ghost diver lifted a hand. Not a wave. 2 fingers. Brief. Clinical. Then he sank. No bubbles followed. The water closed over him like he had never existed. My radio clicked. Status. The true answer would bring heat. The false one might buy seconds. Tourniquet secure. Bleed controlled. Pneumothorax. Decompressed, I said, and hated how smooth it sounded. The word hung between surf and gunfire, fragile as spun glass. I dragged the casualty backward toward cover. Wet sand chewed at my knees. The Zodiac rocked again, a shiver through the hull like an animal trying to shake off pain. Gravity always wins. I said it low, not for anyone else. A reminder. A rule. Out there, the ghost diver had made a choice. Not to attack. Not to finish us. To let me live. The surf groaned louder. A deep rumble that vibrated through the deck, underscoring the lie I'd just transmitted. The water in the decon tent ran lukewarm, never hot, like the system didn't believe in comfort. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a steady insect hum that drilled into the skull. I held my hands under the stream and watched diluted red spiral toward the drain. The water flowed steadily from the faucet, a monotonous drip and splash that amplified the enclosed space's oppression. Dried blood didn't wash off. It surrendered in layers. Chlorhexidine stung the small cuts I hadn't noticed until now. My forearms ached from bracing the casualty, from fighting the Zodiac's kick, from pretending the blast hadn't climbed into my ribs and taken up residence. The air smelled sterile and recycled, like a submarine that hated people. My black coffee thermos sat on her bench beside my medic bag. Quiet now. Too quiet. I didn't trust quiet. Quiet meant something was saving itself. I scrubbed harder, as if friction could erase what I'd said into the radio. Brix came in without knocking, because of course he did. He filled the doorway with wet gear and presents, then tried to shrink it with a grin. Doc, he said, like it was casual. You good? I watched him in the mirror, not directly. Eye contact was a luxury. His face was flushed from cold and adrenaline. He shifted heel to toe like he could stomp fear out through the floor. It came out as a wet cough. The smell hit me. Blood metal, salt, diesel, and the sour edge of shock. Stay with me, I said, and it wasn't comfort. It was an order. His breathing was off. One side lagged. Every inhale a climb. I kept my face close enough to hear the change, close enough to catch the slip. The ARS needle clicked in my grip. I didn't think about its name. I thought about the sound I needed next. Resistance. Then a give. A hiss followed, sudden and ugly, like air escaping a tire. The sound made my teeth ache. His next breath came easier. Not good. Easier. Ket, I said. My heartbeat was a dull thump in my ears, slow enough that my mind grabbed something stupid and clinical. Mammalian diving reflex. Cold water taught the body to conserve. Funny what the brain used as shelter. The thump slowed further, a long pause between beats that stretched the moment. Why? I asked. He shrugged. Too big. Too loose. Protocol. You know how it is. He unzipped the bag with a soft zip that sounded louder than it should have. The fluorescent hum seemed to lean in. My thermos gave one small clink, and my nerves tried to join it, a tremor waking up now that I didn't have blood to stop. Bricks overchecked. Not a quick search for missing supplies. Not a normal inventory sweep. He patted pockets twice. Then again, like he was confirming a map. His fingers paused on a pouch, breath hitching like debt whispering back. He pulled gauze out and shoved it back in. He checked the side pouch, then checked it again. Too careful. Too focused. Too practiced. Bricks, I said, and my voice came out flatter than I meant. What are you doing? He smiled harder. The kind of smile that existed to cover a problem. Something small slid free and hit the bench with a plastic tick. A plain, thumb-sized device with a label maker strip that read Logistics. Beside it, a folded paper log, creased tight, edges damp like it had been handled with wet gloves and guilty hands. My stomach dropped with the clean certainty of a stopped bleed. Like a tag for failed organs. That's not mine, I said. Bricks stared at it like it surprised him, but his breath hitched a fraction too late. The performance lagged. The mask slipped. Doc. I don't know, he said, and his voice lost its swagger. Loud man going quiet. The tent flap snapped open. 2 agents stepped in, dark jackets over fatigues, faces set in that professional blankness that wasn't calm. It was decided. Behind them, another pair. Different posture, different eyes. FBI. NCIS. The letters blurred for a second because my focus kept snapping back to the device on the bench, to how clean it looked, how unearned. Captain Elena Voss. One agent asked. I'm right here, I said. Soap and iodine coated my tongue. My hands were still wet, still smelling like blood. His gaze dropped to the bench. The log. The device? He didn't touch them yet. He didn't have to. The room had already shifted. We have a warrant for your detention, he said. You are being taken into custody pending investigation. Investigation of what? My mouth asked, before my brain could stop it. Material support. Sabotage. Treason. He said the last word like he'd practiced it, like he liked how it landed. Behind me, Bricks made a sound that wasn't a word. A cough. A swallowed apology. Or maybe just air. Easy. Doc, he said. Just protocol. That line didn't belong to him. It sounded borrowed, planted, like the device. Hands closed on my wrists. Cold metal-kissed skin. The cuffs shut with a clean, final click-click. The sound punched through the fluorescent hum and went straight into my molars. I didn't fight. Fighting was for people who believed the system was still deciding. I'd seen the way the agents walked in. I'd seen Bricks's over-checking. The practiced hands, the careful touch that said he already knew what he would find. My thermos rattled once. Sharp. Phantom tremor finally getting its moment. My body betraying me when it didn't matter and going steady when it did. They guided me toward the exit. Canvas brushed my shoulder. Outside, the air tasted like wet concrete and exhaust. Somewhere, a helicopter spooled up. Not for me. As they walked me past cots and staring faces, a thought settled in with the same clarity as the tourniquet bite. The system had already decided. The air in the interrogation room tasted like recycled metal. Cold came out of a vent in a steady hum you felt behind your eyes, not loud enough to notice until it stopped. The table was bolted down and scarred at the edges where boots and cuffs had argued with it. My wrists were free now, but the skin remembered the bite. Red lines. Heat underneath. 2 agents sat across from me. One had a legal pad he didn't need. The other had eyes that kept returning to my hands. Like hands, were always guilty. They let the silence run first. Procedural friction. Make me fill the space. Make me confess into my own echo. Captain Voss, the note-taker said at last. His voice sounded practiced, clean, like it had been washed. You understand why you're here. I understand why you think I'm here, I said. The watcher's mouth tightened. He didn't like the difference. He slid a folder across the metal, stopping it short of my fingers. Not close enough to be polite. Close enough to be tempting. Material support, he said. Unauthorized medical logistics. A pattern. Pattern meant they'd already chosen the shape of my guilt. I didn't touch the folder. I kept my palms flat on the table and felt the cold seep in. Subtly down the hall, a door closed. The sound carried thin through the bass, final enough to make my jaw lock. What unit? I asked. Yours, the watcher said. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The vent hummed. My heartbeat slowed. The same reflex that kicked in underwater when the body decided oxygen was a budget item. Mammalian diving reflex. Funny how the body tried to save me, even when the system didn't. The door opened. Commander Marcus Hale walked in like he owned the air. He didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. He was just there, filling the space with a kind of calm that didn't ask permission. A toothpick rode the corner of his mouth, shifting once, then clicking softly against his teeth. The click echoed sharply in the silence, a sound that asserted control without words. The agents stiffened. Hale looked at them like they were paperwork. Gentlemen, he said, I'll take this. Sir, with respect, the note-taker began. Hale's toothpick snapped between his fingers. Not loud. Sharp. A punctuation mark. He set it back at his lip, shifted it, clicked it once more. The click lingered, underscoring his authority. Outside, he said. The watcher leaned forward, trying to hold ground with posture. This is a federal matter. Hale didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He reached into his pocket and placed a badge wallet on the table without opening it. The gesture wasn't for me. It was for them. A quiet lever. I already spoke to your liaison, he said. You can leave now. Or you can stay and explain to your supervisor why you ignored a direct order routed through base command. The agents traded a look. It wasn't anger. It was calculation. Chairs scraped. The watcher gathered the folder, then hesitated. Hale tapped the table once with 2 fingers. The watcher set it down and stood. No debate. No scene. The door shut behind them. The room felt smaller, without their bodies soaking up the hum. Hale took the chair across from me and dropped another file on the table. It landed with a dull slap that made the metal ring. The toothpick clicked again, softer this time, like he was thinking through it. "You smell like chlorhexidine," he said. "That's the romance of my job," I said. He gave a brief exhale that might have been a laugh if he'd allowed himself that much. "Open it." I did. Autopsy photos. Redacted names. Dates stacked too close together. I went straight for tox and labs. Habit. Some part of me still believed data didn't lie. Ketamine was there. Not as a field analgesic. Not as rescue. The doses were wrong. The frequency, wrong. It showed up in places it had no business being, like a fingerprint someone forgot to wipe. Ketamine doses match renal crash patterns. Then the organ panels, kidney markers climbing, liver values collapsing. Not trauma. Not infection. Chemistry. My throat went tight. "This isn't accidental," I said. Hale's gaze stayed on my face, not the pages. "Spectra," he said. The word sat between us like a diagnosis. "Internal," I said, and the certainty hit hard. "You're doing this to your own divers." Hale shifted the toothpick. Click. "To assets," he corrected. "Divers who don't bounce back. Failures who still need to move." I flipped one more page. The pattern held. A slow chemical drowning on dry land. "They framed me," I said. "Yes," Hale said. No pause. No comfort. "Why are you here?" I asked. He leaned back and let the chair creak. "Because you're useful," he said, "and because the way they did it was sloppy." I shut the file. My hands were steady. That scared me more than shaking. Hale glanced at the wall clock. The second hand moved like it enjoyed its job. He stood, and his presence pulled the room upright with him. "You have 20 minutes. Then you're nobody." The locked line landed clean. No drama, no sympathy. 20 to do what? I asked, even though my body already knew. "To run," he said, "or to sit here while they bury you under process and call it justice." He turned toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. The toothpick snapped again. Quiet. "This doesn't fix the system," he said. "It just keeps you alive long enough to decide what you're willing to lose." The door closed. The hum stayed. The clock kept moving. And somewhere in the base, paperwork was already becoming a grave. Keys clacked in uneven bursts, a nervous rhythm that bounced off tall shelves and old carpet. The public library after midnight felt like a place that had survived too many stories and learned to stop caring. Stale air sat low, warmed by tired computers and a radiator that ticked when it tried to work. A printer whined in the distance, then went silent again, like it regretted speaking. My hands hovered over the keyboard. Phantom tremor woke up the second fine motor mattered. A faint shake, just enough to make the cursor dance, just enough to turn confidence into mistakes. The tremor felt like a real entity, pressing in, attacking from within as if my body was its battlefield. I anchored my wrists against the table edge, pressed bone to laminate, and breathed until the movement shrank to a manageable insult. I didn't hack anything. I didn't have time for myths. I used what the system had already given me, an old portal, a forgotten logistics interface tied to a unit that, on paper, didn't take losses, cached credentials that still lived in muscle memory. My fingers started to type a username, drifted off by one letter, corrected. The tremor teased. I pinned my left wrist harder and forced my right hand to behave. The screen flickered, then loaded a bland page that smelled like bureaucracy. Grey boxes, drop-down menus, timestamps. No dramatic lockouts. No alarms. Just the quiet danger of access that nobody remembered to revoke. Somewhere outside the library, a car passed on wet pavement, tires hissing. My chest tightened anyway. I pulled up requisitions by unit code, then by date, then by category. My eyes didn't scan like a civilian's. They sorted. Normal items drifted by in neat rows. Gauze, saline, tourniquets, glove sizes. The kind of supplies you reordered because people bled and nobody cared about the paperwork as long as it arrived. Then the list turned wrong. Dialysis filters. Not one box. Not an emergency order. Repeated shipments, scheduled with the calm certainty of routine. Filters weren't for the healthy. Filters were for organs that had quit doing their job. I clicked into details and felt my tongue go dry. My tremor kicked up again. Fine motor panic. I steadied my hands, focusing on the clack of each key press, the urgent rhythm pulling me through. High-grade painkillers and cross-reference deliveries showed up in quantities too consistent, too generous, like damage was forecast. The pattern sat polite and undeniable. I drilled deeper, into roots. A warehouse tag repeated, a coastal distribution node with a pier number attached. The same location showed up across months, across units, as if it was the throat everything ran through. I clicked into medical notes attached to one requisition. Redacted fields. A bland checkbox labelled renal support. Another labelled behavioural compliance. The words were sterile enough to make me want to break something. They're not treating divers, I murmured, voice low so it didn't wake the room. They're treating failures. The sentence tasted like metal. Outside, a siren wailed past the library windows, interrupting the quiet. The tremor kicked once, hard, then settled when I gripped the edge harder. The clock was still running, except now I could see what it was counting toward. I shut the portal, not because it would protect me, but because it would buy me seconds. I slid my hands off the keyboard. The tremor returned the moment the work paused, a petty shake that said my body still wanted to be human. I grabbed my thermos. The metal was cool through the fabric. My grip steadied. The warehouse address sat in my mind like a hook, and it didn't feel like a discovery. It felt like an appointment. Metal clanked in the wind like the pier was arguing with itself. Loose chains tapped steel in uneven intervals, a lazy percussion that made distance hard to judge. A dock ladder rattled, then settled, then rattled again, as if something unseen kept testing it. The air carried that coastal bite that made gums ache, salt and diesel and cold damp that crept under clothing and refused to leave. Wind rushed through gaps, sharp and constant. Pre-dawn wasn't dark anymore. It was grey and waiting, the kind of light that felt provisional. I kept to the shadows where the warehouse lights failed to reach, moving along stacked containers and shallow puddles that reflected the security lamps in broken fragments. Every step on the grated catwalk scraped just enough to feel incriminating. My breath fogged once, faint, then vanished. The thermos in my bag gave a soft clink with each shift of my weight, that spoon memory sound that always tried to wake the tremor. I tightened the strap until it shut up. The address from the library sat in my head like a hook. Pier number, delivery node, time window, tonight. Not a discovery. An appointment. Pallets were staged near the edge, shrink-wrapped and tagged. Forklift tracks cut through wet grit like scars that never healed. The manifests were clipped in plastic sleeves, swinging in the wind like cheap flags. I didn't need to read everything. I needed proof the pattern wasn't just in my head. Dialysis filters came in heavy cartons with sterile markings you didn't confuse for anything else. Medical supply labels were designed to look boring. These didn't look boring, they looked deliberate. I was 3 steps from the nearest pallet when someone breathed behind me. Not a dramatic inhale, a controlled one. Close enough that my skin tightened before my thoughts caught up. "Doc," Brick said. My body reacted first. Weight dropped. Shoulders braced. I turned into him instead of away, and my right hand went to my kit on reflex. The tremor vanished the second my fingers had a job. Bricks stood between two containers, hood up, face half-shadowed, eyes bright with the kind of fear that pretended to be confidence. Wind pushed at him, snapping his jacket. He looked bigger than he was, because he needed to. His build was solid, broad shoulders that filled the space, hands large enough to suggest strength but trembling slightly now. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. "Funny," I said. "They said the same thing about me being alive." He tried to grin. It didn't hold. His gaze slid to my medic bag and lingered a beat too long. That was the tell. Not the ambush. Not the timing. The overchecking lived in his eyes. "Don't," I said. He lifted his hands, palms out, like we were having a reasonable talk. "Just talk. We can fix this." "Fix what?" I kept my voice flat, adult, uninteresting. "The part where you planted evidence, or the part where you walked me into cuffs?" His jaw flexed. A pulse jumped in his neck. Debt lived there. Not ideology, not loyalty, just numbers that never stopped adding up. "You don't get it," he said. "They don't care about you. They care about what you're carrying." I shifted half a step, putting my body between him and the pallet labels. His eyes flicked. Hungry. Overchecking again. "You were never the target. You were the container." The line came out practiced, like someone had given it to him to make it feel cleaner. Cold moved through my ribs. Recognition, not fear. "You owe them," I said. His grin cracked. "You think I wanted this? You're doing it anyway." Wind slammed a chain against a post. Metal clanged. We both flinched, stupid and human for the same half-second. Brick surged. No clean punch. Just weight and panic, trying to wrap me and drive me into the container wall. His forearm jammed into my throat. Steel met my back hard enough to knock air out of me. Cold salt damp smeared my cheek. Diesel and blood filled my mouth where my lip split. "Just stop," he hissed, face close, breath ragged. "Let me call it in. You'll live." I didn't answer. Answers were leverage. My left hand found the side pocket of my kit and came out with trauma shears. Not a knife. Not a fantasy. A tool. He laughed, sharp and scared. "You gonna cut me, Doc?" I slid the blunt tip under the strap, crossing his shoulder, and squeezed. Fabric gave with an ugly snip, clean, final, the sound of something severed, echoing the cut in relations. He jerked back on instinct, protecting gear. Pressure eased. I dropped my chin, twisted, and dragged air back into my lungs. He grabbed my bag strap, yanking hard. The thermos clinked, loud now, and the tremor tried to climb my arm. I shoved it down with motion. "Always the bag," I said. "You can't help yourself." He fumbled for zippers, eyes darting, fingers sloppy, overchecking, confirming. I drove an elbow into his ribs. Not pretty, just effective. He slammed me sideways into the container edge. Pain flared across my shoulder, hot then dull. I hooked the shears against his wrist and twisted. His grip broke. The thermos dropped half an inch inside the bag and clinked again. My hands stayed steady anyway. Brick staggered back, breathing hard, eyes wet with more than shame family bills flashing. "I didn't have a choice," he said. "I know what systems do," I said. "They squeeze until you break. Then they blame the break." His hand went to his pocket. "Phone." My stomach tightened. "Bricks," I said, softer. "Don't." He hesitated. Then his thumb moved. I lunged. Fingers caught plastic. The phone hit concrete and cracked. He still tried to hit the call. I brought the blunt end of the shears down and crushed it. Small sound. Final. He stared at the wreck. "You just cost me." "I know," I said. "You cost me first." He slipped on wet grit, catching himself on a pallet. A manifest sleeve swung and slapped his cheek. He flinched. The labels were right there. Dialysis filters, painkillers, unit codes that didn't belong. "They said it was just supply," he whispered. "It is," I said. "For failure, for compliance." A sound came from below the pier. 3 soft taps on metal. The pier groaned, long and heavy. Bricks went pale. He's already there. The water under the pier was darker than it should have been, even with dawn trying to exist above it. The world narrowed to wet wood overhead, the black teeth of pilings and the low groan of stressed metal that travelled through everything like a warning you felt more than heard. I had a rebreather. Not un miracle. À compromise. The mouthpiece tasted like rubber and old disinfectant. Each inhale came with a faint hiss from the valve rebreather, a soft rush interspersed with my thoughts. Hiss. Each exhale vanished, swallowed instead of blooming into bubbles. Hiss. No bubbles meant no forgiveness. Cold hit first, a squeeze around my ribs that made my skin feel borrowed. Water found the bruise on my shoulder and set it throbbing. My split lip burned, salty, a small pain compared to the pressure pressing in from all sides. Pressure had hands down here. I moved slow, letting the harness settle, letting the gear become part of me. My thermos stayed topside. Noise was betrayal. The tremor mattered less underwater. Down here, everything reduced to steadiness or drowning. The mammalian diving reflex kicked in cleanly. Heart rate dropped. Time stretched thin and precise. I followed the pier supports, fingertips brushing algae-slick wood, feeling vibration through bone. A chain swayed with the tide, tapping a piling in a patient, dull rhythm. That was when I saw it. A limpet mine, fixed to a steel support where the pier met reinforced beam. Compact, silent, purposeful. A message. A thin line ran from the housing to a secondary contact point, almost invisible, anti-tamper. Not curiosity-proof. Punishment-proof. I wasn't EOD. I didn't touch it with my hands. I didn't rush. Panic made corpses. Above me, the pier shifted with a wave. The sound travelled through metal into my teeth. The mine didn't move. It didn't need to. I hovered and let the problem simplify itself. If I backed off, I lived longer and nothing changed. If I triggered it, I died, and nothing changed. I brought out the cryospray, fingers clumsy in gloves. The tremor whispered. I pinned my elbow against the piling. Bone to wood. Stability borrowed. The can was colder than the water, a hard promise in my grip. I aimed at the exposed section of the anti-tamper mechanism and pressed. Frost bloomed, white and ghostly, clouding the water. Metal dulled, then paled, then rhymed with crystalline ice. Movement slowed, not stopped. Slowed, like a heart forced to behave. Cold bit through the glove, sharp and honest. I watched the response, not my hope. The pier groaned again, heavier. I reached for bone cement. The tube resisted, stiff with cold. I pressed it into place, using it as a brace, not a fix. It fought me, then began to set, releasing a faint warmth that felt obscene under ice. The mine ticked once inside its housing. My heart tried to surge. The reflex pushed it back down. I pulled away slowly, careful not to wake the water. Then I saw him, a silhouette beyond the pilings where light failed. No bubbles, no motion, just presence. Ghost diver. He watched the way he always did, like I was data. The mine sat on the beam like a claim. Spectra didn't announce itself. It branded infrastructure, owned routes, owned bodies. Mine like Spectra's slow poison, but viral? The pier groaned. Vibration travelling through the mine into my fingertips. Gravity always wins. The words weren't sound. They were certainty. The ghost diver shifted. Closer. Not to help. The drip found a rhythm before I did. It came off the ceiling somewhere behind me, slow and mean, landing in a shallow puddle that smelled like salt and old electricity. Each drop echoed through the bunker like it was trying to wake something up. Drip. My breath sounded wrong in the space. Too loud. Too close. Pain kept time in my chest. A dull pressure that came and went like a bad idea. I found her slumped against the far wall, half hidden behind a rusted console that hadn't powered anything since before I was born. Lara. Her head lolled when I stepped closer, hair stuck to her face with sweat and blood. She was pale in that waxy way that never meant tired. It meant emptying. Her breathing was shallow, fast, the kind that cheats. I raised the pistol without thinking. Habit. Training. The weight of it steadied my hand, even as the tremor whispered its usual garbage. The bunker hummed faintly. Ozone and damp concrete, the sound of water moving through old pipes like it still had somewhere to be. She smiled when she saw the gun. A thin thing, almost polite. You took an oath, Doc. Do no harm, right? I chambered around. The click cracked the quiet. You killed 2 guards. Oath doesn't apply to monsters. Her eyes flicked to the sound, then back to me. Calm, considering. They were cleaners. Like me. And like you soon. The words stuck. Not because they were clever, because they were close. Blood had soaked through her side and into the concrete, dark and spreading, following the slope of the floor like it knew gravity better than either of us. I crouched without deciding to. My knees complained. My ribs answered. I don't need saving, Doc. I need patching up. I laughed once, short and ugly. Then the smell hit me properly. Iron. Ozone. Wet stone. The bunker pressed in. Cold seeping through my boots. Into my bones. I didn't see an enemy anymore. I saw a problem bleeding out on bad ground. I holstered the gun. That choice landed heavier than any shot. She watched my hands. Everyone always did. I cut fabric and found the wound. It was worse than it looked, and better than it felt, which is the worst combination. Blood bubbled when she tried to inhale too deep. Not a scream wound. A quiet one. The kind that lies. I did one thing, the only thing that would buy time. I didn't explain it. I didn't apologize. My fingers went where they had to go, pressure and heat and the soft resistance of living tissue pushing back. She gasped and bit down hard enough that her jaw clicked. The drip stuttered overhead. Drip. She grabbed my wrist. Weak. Desperate. You save me, she said between breaths, and I give you a name. There it was. The bargain. Ugly. Necessary. But she stated it like a fact, not a plea, a simple transaction in the dark. I finished the job and leaned back on my heels. My hands shook now. Let them. Start talking, I said. Slow. She smiled again, this time real. Spectra is a shell. The real spine is tagged under logistics. She swallowed. Virus exploits Spectra's kidney markers. Ask for the virus manifest. Ask for who signed it last. The bunker seemed to hold its breath. Outside, water moved. Somewhere far off, metal groaned. I stood up and wiped my hands on my pants, leaving dark streaks I wouldn't bother hiding. Lara slumped, breathing easier, not safe. Never safe. Just not dead yet. The drip started again, marking time like a metronome. I knew what came next. I just didn't know how much it would cost me this time. The band hit a triumphant note that landed wrong in my chest, the brass too clean, too confident. Applause followed on cue, bright and hollow, engineered for distance. I stood just off stage, where the spill of light thinned into shadow, and the air smelled faintly of starch and floor polish. Medals flashed. Smiles locked in place. Everything looked bleached, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Celebration had a rhythm, and tonight it didn't match the truth underneath it. The wrong kind of applause always rushed. It tried to get ahead of what it was clapping for. I adjusted my sleeve and felt the familiar weight strapped against my forearm. Not a folder. A stack. Logs printed because systems could be rewritten and clouds could forget, but paper stayed obediently heavy. Ink didn't vanish when someone retired. My thermos tapped once against my ribs when I shifted my stance. A soft, annoying sound. I ignored it. I still hadn't learned to leave it behind. Some habits pretended to be superstition. Others were just ballast you kept because you'd drowned once without it. Commander Marcus Hale didn't watch the stage. He watched the exits. He stood exactly where ceremony bled into corridor, where applause thinned and people started speaking honestly again. A toothpick worked the corner of his mouth like a metronome, keeping time no one else could hear. He looked older in person than in the framed photos lining the walls. Not weaker, just heavier. When he saw me, he nodded once. Not approval. Recognition. The kind you give a known risk you've already decided to carry. Walk, he said, already turning. We moved past framed photographs of older victories and younger faces, men who still believed plaques meant something permanent. The music dulled into a muffled swell behind us, like the building itself was trying to forget what it was celebrating. The hallway smelled of polish and old decisions, the kind that never made it into speeches or press releases. A door closed somewhere. Another opened. Quiet machinery doing quiet work. "I'm not here to be saved," I said, because the sentence had learned how to say itself, and habits die louder when you ignore them. Hale snorted. The toothpick snapped between his teeth. "You're here to be useful." I handed him the logs without ceremony. Just enough pressure that he had to take them. He didn't flip through. He weighed them in his palm, testing mass and consequence like ballast before a dive. Paper made a soft sound when he adjusted his grip. Honest sound. Cold chain discrepancies, I said. Ghost shipments. Trial lots moved as loss. Accumulated drift across 3/4. Names don't matter. Patterns do. They always do, he said. He stopped at a small office with no plaque and waved me in. The applause swelled again somewhere behind us. Louder now, farther away. The band hit another note that didn't belong to the room. Hale set the stack on the desk and pressed a button recessed into the wood. The button press clicked softly, a contrast to the distant clapping, underscoring the quiet power shift. No announcement. No alert tones. Somewhere in the building, calendars quietly changed shape. Quiet discipline, he said. Not to me. To the room. Freeze accounts tied to these batch codes. Reassign quartermasters to training billets effective immediately. Invite the rest to coffee. A pause. Then, softer. Yes. Tonight. I waited for anger. For bargaining. For the system to bare its teeth and remind me who owned the floor. None of it came. What settled instead was relief edged with dread, like anesthesia wearing off too early. The open loop tightened. Clean. Efficient. Would it bury me anyway once the room was done with me? Hale leaned back. You didn't bring me a scandal, he said. You brought me a liability. Spectra, I said. He shook his head. A symptom. The door opened. A captain I recognized avoided my eyes and left with a thin, practiced smile, already rehearsing a different version of tonight. Somewhere else, a phone rang and kept ringing until someone decided not to answer it. I'm done, Hale said. He didn't raise his voice. Relieved of command. Early retirement. They'll call it voluntary. That's the cost? I asked. His jaw worked once. That's the part they'll admit. The band finished a number to thunderous applause. Hale stood and straightened his jacket, the motion automatic, muscle memory from a career of... That was the problem. The turn came quietly. Right about the moment the applause peaked, the system amputated Spectra. Not the idea. The limb. Labs shuttered. Funding. Evaporated. Names slipped out of org charts like misprints erased in pencil. Efficient. Bloodless. Incomplete the way most cures are. You'll be buried in paperwork, Hale said. Not prison. Not praise. Paper. I can live with paper, I said. He met my eyes then. For a second, he looked older than the photographs in the hallway. They'll mark you high risk. Not here. Everywhere. The applause resumed. Smaller now. Controlled. Managed. The ceremony flowed around us like water around a piling, pretending nothing underneath had shifted. My thermos rattled again. I stilled it with my hand. My phone vibrated. A single coordinate. No text. No sender. Spectra adapted. It always would. Gravity didn't care what name you gave the fall. Hale opened the door back toward the light. "Go," he said, "before the band plays you out." I stepped into the corridor and let the sound swallow me. The wrong applause faded behind my ribs. The tremor found a new rhythm. I followed it. The coastal road was empty in the specific way only service roads ever were. Not abandoned, not ruined, just quietly left behind, wide enough for convoys that no longer came. Built for weight and repetition, then patched and repatched until the asphalt felt more scar than surface, every seam a reminder of something heavy that had once passed through and never bothered to return. The barriers on either side rose in dull concrete slabs, their edges chipped and weathered, channels worn where water and wind had learned the fastest way through. Night had settled in for real, not the kind that eased its way down and left room for doubt, but the committed dark that pressed close and stayed. Wind worked through the cracks in the barriers, whistling low and steady, threading through gaps that hadn't been part of the design. It carried salt and cold and the distant breath of the sea, moving with the patience of something that knew it would outlast whatever had been built to stop it. The wind threaded through the window glass, a soft hiss that added to the isolation. I sat in the car with the engine off. The windows cracked just enough to let the air in. The smell of kelp mixed with old oil and hot rubber that hadn't quite cooled, sharp enough to cut through the lingering scent of disinfectant on my jacket. My shoulder ached when I shifted. A dull, persistent throb that didn't spike or fade, just stayed. A reminder that I'd been alive earlier and had paid for it. The bandage underneath my jacket itched. Healing always did that. It never felt like progress while it was happening. It just felt irritating and slow, like being reminded of a debt you couldn't pay off all at once. High risk. The phrase hadn't been said out loud, but it followed me anyway. It clung to me like a label someone forgot to peel off, the edges curled, but still stuck fast, partially cleared, functionally outside. The kind of status that let you keep breathing as long as you didn't ask for anything else. No access, no protection, no appeal. The system hadn't kicked me out. It had done something worse. It had stepped back and watched, interested, to see where I'd fall. The burner phone vibrated in the cup holder. Not loud, just enough to make the plastic buzz against itself, a small, insistent sound that cut through the wind. I didn't grab it right away. Let the wind finish a thought first. Let it run its fingers along the concrete and the car frame and my nerves. Then another vibration, closer together now. Impatient. A message. From a number I hadn't saved and didn't need to. Coordinates. Clean. Precise. No margin for error. And one line beneath them, unadorned, like it had cost something to send. Spectra is just the symptom. I found the virus. The content felt even colder, a stark warning without warmth or explanation. The word landed harder than it should have. Virus, not spectra, not infrastructure, not funding streams or committees or men with badges who learned exactly when to look away. Virus meant origin. It meant intent. It meant whatever spectra had been holding in place was no longer contained. Containment had been ugly, violent, expensive. It had bent rules and people and ethics until they screamed. But it had worked. Mostly. Virus, a spectra's biological shadow, exploiting chemical scars. I leaned back and stared through the windshield. Somewhere out there, lights moved along the coast, steady and indifferent, tracing paths that had nothing to do with this. Cars went places for ordinary reasons. Boats cut lines across the dark water. Spectra hadn't been the disease. It had been the quarantine. Something you hated while it existed and missed the moment it was gone. The wind pushed harder through the cracks, rattling something loose in the door, a dry, uneven sound. I clicked my pen without realizing it. Once. Twice. The small plastic snap anchored me. An old habit from a life where small rituals kept larger things from slipping out of reach. Lara hadn't contacted me to apologize. She hadn't contacted me to ask permission. She'd sent coordinates because she knew I'd come, because the system had already marked me, and there was nothing left to protect by staying still. High risk didn't mean reckless. It meant exposed. I folded the phone shut and felt the tremor in my hand fade as soon as I moved. Motion quieted the noise. Stillness invited it in. The road waited. Wind pushed harder. But sometimes you can make it wait. I replayed the message once more, just to be sure the word didn't change. Virus. It still hit harder than Spectra. Spectra had weight. Budget. Buildings with controlled access and polished floors. It had org charts and briefing decks, and people who could explain it in neutral language. Virus was quieter. It slipped. It adapted. It didn't need permission or oversight. It didn't announce itself. It just spread, patient and efficient. Virus spreads via Spectra's failed organs, invisible as rebreather. The phone's screen went dark again, leaving a faint afterimage burned into my eyes. I deleted a contact from the burner without looking at the name. The gesture was automatic, practiced. Some things were easier when you didn't let yourself hesitate. I wrapped the phone in a rag and slid it into the glove box, tucking it into the corner like it might leak if I left it exposed. I checked the bandage at my shoulder, pressed carefully, testing limits. My fingers came away clean enough to lie to myself, clean enough to keep going. I reached for the thermos and topped it off from a dented bottle, the metal clinking softly as it met the rim, too softly. In the stillness, the tremor came back, subtle at first, then stronger, making the thermos rattle against the console like it was trying to say something I already knew. I froze, listened. Wind moving through concrete seams, distant surf. Slow and heavy, the sea breathing in its sleep. No footsteps, no engine I didn't recognize, no correction coming down from above. The kind of quiet that wasn't safety, just absence. The tremor eased when I opened the door and stepped out into the night. Cold air cut through the car's stale warmth. Movement always helped. Stillness gave things time to talk back, gave fear room to organize itself into something coherent. High risk meant no one was coming to stop me, or save me. It meant I was already expendable enough to be useful again. That thin, dangerous space where loyalty and abandonment overlapped, where the system pretended it wasn't watching while it waited to see what you'd do next. I slid back into the driver's seat, wiped condensation from the glass with my sleeve, and started the engine. The sound felt too loud at first, invasive, then settled into something manageable, familiar. A reminder that physics still applied, even out here. The engine roared to life with a sudden ignition, breaking the quiet abruptly. The thermos stilled, the tremor faded. I pulled onto the road and followed the coordinates into the dark. Gravity always wins.